It was a cold winter's night in 1993 when a young woman's life was brutally taken in the small town of Fairbanks, Alaska. Sophie Sergie, a 20-year-old student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, was found murdered in a dormitory bathroom. She had been sexually assaulted and shot multiple times, and her body was left in a gruesome scene. Years went by, and the case remained unsolved. It wasn't until more than a decade later that a breakthrough in the investigation led to a stunning revelation. The killer was finally identified, and the truth behind Sophie's murder was revealed. Hello and welcome to Dark Secrets, your channel dedicated to exploring some of the most fascinating and haunting crimes in American history. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out. Sophie Sergie was born and raised in Pitcairn Point, a small village in Alaska. Growing up in a close-knit community, Sophie was known for her kind heart and infectious smile. She was a bright and ambitious young woman who dreamed of a better life for herself and her family. As a child, Sophie attended school in the village, but as she grew older, she realized that she needed more opportunities to pursue her goals. She left Pitcairn Point and moved to Fairbanks, where she enrolled in the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Sophie was a diligent student who worked hard to earn her degree in rural development. She was passionate about finding ways to improve the lives of people in remote communities like her own, and she hoped to make a difference in the world. Despite the challenges she faced as a young Alaska Native woman living far from home, Sophie never lost her determination or her sense of humor. She made friends easily and was beloved by all who knew her. Sophie's life was full of promise and hope, and those who knew her were excited to see what the future held for this bright young woman. But tragically, her life was cut short in a senseless act of violence that shocked the community and shattered the dreams of those who loved her. Sophie Sergie's life came to a sudden and violent end on a cold February night in 1993. She was a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and on that fateful night, she had gone to stay with a friend in one of the dormitories on campus. At some point during the night, Sophie went to the bathroom, and it was there that she was attacked. She was sexually assaulted and then shot multiple times, in what appeared to be a brutal act of revenge. The scene of the crime was gruesome and chaotic, with blood and bullet casings scattered throughout the bathroom. Sophie's body was left in the bathroom, and it was only discovered hours later when her friend went to check on her. The police arrived on the scene and launched a full-scale investigation, but despite their best efforts, they were unable to identify the killer. The crime scene was complex and difficult to decipher, and there were few clues to go on. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the case grew colder, and the trail of the killer grew fainter. Sophie's family and friends were left to grapple with the loss of their loved one, and the community was left in shock and disbelief at the senseless violence that had taken place. The details of Sophie's murder would haunt the community for years to come, as they searched for answers and hoped for justice to be served. But for now, the killer remained at large, and the truth behind this heinous crime remained a mystery. In the early stages of the investigation, the police focused their attention on potential suspects who had access to the dormitory where Sophie was murdered. They interviewed residents of the dormitory and looked for anyone who had a motive or opportunity to commit the crime. But as the investigation progressed, the list of suspects grew longer, and the police began to consider other possibilities. They looked into whether the crime could have been committed by someone outside the university or whether it could be connected to other crimes in the area. Despite their efforts, the police were unable to identify a clear suspect, and the case grew colder over time. New leads would occasionally arise, but each one led to a dead end, and the killer remained at large. But in 2007, new hope emerged when the Alaska State Troopers received a grant to test DNA evidence from cold cases. The evidence from Sophie's murder was tested, and it produced a match to DNA found at the scene of another unsolved murder in Maine. This breakthrough led the police to focus their attention on the East Coast and to investigate potential suspects in Maine. One of the suspects who came to the attention of the police was Stephen H. Downs, who had been a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks at the time of Sophie's murder. Downs was living in Maine and working as a nurse when the police identified him as a potential suspect. On February 13, 2019, Maine State Police and Alaska State Troopers had come knocking on Stephen Downs' door, asking questions about a murder that had taken place decades earlier. It was a case that had gone unsolved for years, but something had stirred in the hearts of the investigators, and they were determined to get to the bottom of it. The night in question was April 25, 1993. Sophie Sergie had been brutally murdered in her dormitory room at the University of Alaska. At the time, Stephen Downs had been interviewed by investigators, along with his roommate Nicholas Dazer. They had claimed that they knew nothing of significance about the crime, but something about Stephen's demeanor had always been a bit off, and the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that he might be hiding something. Years had passed, and the case had gone cold. But in 2019, the investigators were back, asking Stephen questions once again. He claimed that he had never met Sophie, and that he had no knowledge of her murder. But as the officers pressed him for details, something strange began to happen. Stephen seemed to recognize Sophie's face, but he couldn't explain why. Had he seen her before? The officers showed Stephen a photo of Sophie, and his memory began to stir. He remembered seeing her face on posters around campus, but he insisted that he had never had any contact with her. He also claimed that he had been with his girlfriend on the night of the murder, on the 4th floor of the dormitory. He was adamant that he had never been on the 2nd floor, where Sophie had been killed. The trial of Stephen H. Downs for the murder of Sophie Sergie began in 2019, nearly 3 decades after her death. The courtroom was packed with journalists, spectators, and Sophie's family and friends, all of whom had waited for years to see justice served. The selection of the jury was a critical step in the trial, and both the prosecution and the defense carefully examined each potential juror's background and beliefs. The judge asked the jurors a series of questions to determine whether they could be impartial and fair, and the lawyers on both sides had the opportunity to ask additional questions. Eventually, a jury of 12 was selected, and the trial began in earnest. The prosecution presented a powerful case against Stephen H. Downs, using DNA evidence and witness testimony to paint a picture of a man who had committed a brutal crime. The defense, however, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof that Stephen H. Downs had killed Sophie Sergie. They pointed to other potential suspects and suggested that the investigation had been biased against their client. Throughout the trial, emotions ran high, with tears, anger, and frustration on display in the courtroom. The judge urged the jurors to remain impartial and to base their decision solely on the evidence presented. After several weeks of testimony, the trial came to a close, and the jury began their deliberations. It was a tense time for all involved, as the fate of Stephen H. Downs hung in the balance. Finally, after several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. They found Stephen H. Downs guilty of all charges, including murder and sexual assault. The news of the verdict was a relief to Sophie's family and friends, who had waited for so long to see justice served. They were grateful to the jury for their careful consideration of the evidence and for their willingness to hold Stephen H. Downs accountable for his actions. Thank you for watching this video. We would like to read your own speculations in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.